Across the ancient world, magnificent temples were built in honor of the gods. They were beautifully designed and adorned with statues and pillars, yet even more amazing treasures were to be found inside. An array of weird and wonderful devices would be placed within the temples, each competing to be the most spectacular and allowing the worshippers to communicate with the gods.
For the classical period, it was very important to the priests and temples to attract the crowds, and once the crowds were in there, to give them a fabulous show.
The master of the machines of the gods was the greatest inventor of the ancient world, Heron of Alexandria. Of the vast number of inventions that Heron designed and documented, many of them were designed for use in temples. Heron would have been paid well by the priests to create increasingly outlandish and shocking inventions. He often used ancient hydraulics, combining heat from fires to generate water, air, and steam pressure.
Heron of Alexandria believed in the elasticity of air. He knew the air had substance, it had volume, it was made of particles, and if you pushed it, it would have to go somewhere, and if you sucked it, it would come with you. So these were very important things for him.
One of Heron's favorite tricks was to combine engineering with the practice of making a sacrifice to the gods. He would use the fire that had been kindled on an altar as a power source. The altar would have been transparent, made of either glass or horn. Statues would be above the altar. When a fire was lit, the statues would be seen to dance. Through the heart of the altar was a tube, which turned on a pivot. Connected to this tube are smaller tubes lying at right angles to each other and bent at the extremities in opposite directions. When the sacrifice is kindled, the air growing hot will pass through the tube and will be forced out through the large tube and into the smaller tubes. The air, working like steam power, would create enough force to cause the tube and the dancing figures to revolve. When the altar flames started to die down, the dancing figures would slow and finally come to a halt. Heron's altar with its moving figures would cause him to become a sensation in the ancient world, and sought out by every priest in Alexandria.
Many of his devices and inventions moved statues, and as a consequence they could be used by the religious priests of the time to convince the people that came to the temples that the gods really existed.
And once worshippers went into the temple, they would have to pay for certain services like holy water. This would lead Heron to design the first vending machine in history. It was a simple yet ingenious device, and one that would generate vast amounts of money for the temple priests. A worshipper would place a bronze coin into the machine's slot, and in return would receive a small amount of holy water for the ritual washing of the face and hands before entering the temple. The coin fell into a small pan that hung from one end of a delicately balanced beam. Its weight depressed one end of the beam, thus raising the other end, which opened a valve and allowed the holy water to flow out.
I should have thought that the priests would have leapt at the chance to use such an expert at things mechanical as Heron. The man was clearly a mechanical genius. There were all sorts of things that he was capable of doing, things well beyond the ken of the vast majority of people, including the priests themselves. And they simply placed their orders, doubtless paid his fee, and got their reward when the faithful came in and did the ooh-ah bit and gave their donations to the temple.
In Alexandria, in the early Christian era, we have startling evidence from one of the temple priests of the importance of temple magic. One priest wrote, "We definitely need some striking miracle to advertise our temple. Folk are flocking like sheep after these barbarous new Galilean heresies." Heron, the brilliant scientist and inventor, was only too happy to oblige.
Heron was a master engineer. He was a master craftsman. He saw the opportunity and he put it together to the limit of the fabrication methods available to them at the time.
For temple worshippers, the magic began as soon as they walked through the door. Sometimes the magic began with the doors themselves.
The doors in major temples would have been massive affairs. They could be wood, they could be bronze, they would have lots of elaborate attachments of gold and ivory, and the opening and closing of them seems to have been something which was staged, rather like a piece of theatre. The staging would involve the priests, it could involve choirs who would sing sacred hymns, there would be burning of incense, the lighting of lamps.
Heron devoted much of his attention to making the opening and closing of the temple doors as dramatic as possible. He even contrived it so that the doors would open automatically in synchronization with the altar sacrifice.
One of these devices was so arranged that as the altar heated up, the doors would open and then they would close when the sacrifice was over.
The automatic doors used simple mechanical principles to reinforce the Egyptian priest's authority and prestige throughout ancient temples. As the priest lit the fire on the altar, it heated the air inside a metal cylinder concealed beneath it. This would force the water in it through a siphon into an enormous bucket. The bucket was suspended by chains from a system of weights and pulleys, which turned the doors on their pivots as the buckets became heavier. The temple doors would open as if by magic.
You have to remember that these devices at the time were only working in the temples. So for the average person, they would have never seen anything like this. So you have to imagine how completely awestruck they would have been when they arrived at the temples and the doors magically opened before them.
Though Heron was primarily a brilliant physicist and mechanic, some of the priests used other tools to demonstrate the powers of the gods.